Washington, D.C. remains on high alert just 2 days before the Biden inauguration. We'll discuss the unprecedented security, Donald Trump's legacy, and how the next president hopes to bring the country together. Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo, and this is The Heat. President-elect Joe Biden is expected to call for unity and healing in his inaugural address to the nation on Wednesday. Biden will take the oath of office from the west side of the U.S. Capitol, the very place where pro-Trump supporters stormed the building in an attempt to overturn the election results. The election mall, where crowds would normally gather on Inauguration Day, is now closed, and more than 20,000 armed National Guard troops are guarding the city against the threat of any violence. CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King begins our coverage with this report.
Martin Luther King Day here, celebrating the life of a man who was brutally gunned down in 1968. Remember, he said, "I have a dream." Well, can you imagine him looking on Washington at the moment with 25,000 National Guard troops after white supremacists and others trashed the Capitol on January the 6th. And it's normally a time where you give service back to your community. Joe Biden was helping out at a food bank before he comes here to Washington on Tuesday. And he tried to say that service is a way to unity. Now, we're going to need more than words, but let's take a listen.
Service is a fitting way to start to heal, unite, and rebuild this country we love. I hope you can join us.
Vice President-elect Kamala Harris also helping out a food bank here in Washington before she resigned her Senate seat ahead of being sworn in as vice president on Wednesday, the first woman to hold that role. And also a lot of feeling that things are actually happening. We see all the parade route here. We see the Biden-Harris yellow inauguration posters up. I'm sure Donald Trump can see them as well. And as you know, he's going to be leaving office and leaving Washington before the inauguration, breaking 100 years tradition. But he will leave behind, of course, a deeply divided Washington with 25,000 National Guard on the streets. You know, they're used to going off to Afghanistan and Iraq, but they do realize that they're needed here as well at the moment.
So every guardsman takes an oath, and it's to defend the Constitution from enemies foreign and domestic. And as we've seen, sometimes the enemies are a little closer to home.
And some of those will be looked into too, double-checking security clearances of even the military here, worried about some sort of attack that people don't know about, because of course people thought they were caught by surprise on January the 6th, although the signals were there. For Biden, it's going to be very much moving very quickly to put his agenda in place. He's actually having cabinet members' hearings in the Senate on Tuesday for some of the big ones like Treasury Janet Yellen, Blinken, Secretary of State, Homeland Security, and others as well. He also wants to get a new stimulus bill through the Senate, which the Democrats will control, but only with a tie-breaking vote with Kamala Harris, and also ambitious agendas when it comes to COVID treatment, COVID vaccines, and international rejoining of, for example, the Paris Climate Agreement, trying to get back into the Iran nuclear deal, rejoining the World Health Organization, and of course rolling back some of the environmental and immigration orders that President Trump handed out. It's going to be a very different presidency. The question is, will he be able to govern as well? Nathan King, CGTN, with the White House.
Well, for more now on the U.S. presidential transition, let's bring in our Washington, D.C. panel. Rafael Bernal is a reporter for the U.S. political newspaper The Hill. Douglas Sloan is the principal of National Capital Strategy Group and the vice president of the DC NAACP. Adolfo Franco is an attorney and Republican strategist, and Katie Barlow is an attorney and the social media editor for SCOTUS blog, which focuses on the Supreme Court and the government. Welcome to all of you to the show. And Katie, let's start with some information that's been making news in Washington this Monday, and that is President Trump is preparing to grant pardons or clemency to about 100 people in the final hours in office. What can you tell us about this?
Right, we're hearing reports that he could pardon up to 100 individuals on his way out the door. And look, this is not unexpected. We've already seen that he's pardoned individuals, including former members of his administration and those who pleaded guilty related to the Mueller investigation. So it's not surprising that the president would continue to pardon individuals. The big question mark is when, whether, and how he will pardon himself, and how that will play out in the coming days as he simultaneously faces impeachment in the Senate. Pardoning himself on the way out the door may invite the Senate to move more quickly on the impeachment trial. And it may also invite potential litigants that have charges against him and that are seeking money against him for various different things, will move more quickly and sue him civilly as soon as he's out of office. So I'm looking more toward what and whether he'll issue a self-pardon at this point.
Right. Katie, we're also hearing names like Steve Bannon, Rudy Giuliani. Are they perhaps on the list? And also the other two names we're hearing is Julian Assange and Edward Snowden.
Right. We know that his former Attorney General, Bill Barr, pushed back against the Snowden pardon. But Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon are most certainly on that list. We know that the president has been in contact with both individuals in the past couple of days. Rudy Giuliani was at the White House yesterday and actually said that he would not be able to serve as the president's lawyer during a Senate impeachment trial. Perhaps he's dangling that while he's also seeking a pardon for himself. But we'll have to see what happens in the next 48 hours.
Adolfo Franco, I want to continue talking about these pardons. And, you know, Katie mentioned the possibility of a self-pardon for the president, and possibly he could pardon his adult children as well. What do you make of these last-minute moves by the president?
Well, of course, this is, with all due respect to Katie, this is complete speculation. This has been talked about for some period of time. I really don't believe any of that's going to happen at all. That's not be a self-pardon. I don't think it's going to pardon any of the figures you mentioned. Absolutely nothing unusual about hundreds of pardons at the last minute. Other presidents have done the same thing. I do think some of the president's other associates or others that have been involved in the Russiagate issue could indeed receive a pardon. But I don't believe the self-pardon is in the works. I think it would be questionable whether it would even be possible constitutionally to pardon yourself. But I just don't think that Donald Trump wants to admit that he's done anything wrong. So that was what a pardon would definitely suggest. So I don't believe that is at all likely, and I don't believe Mr. Giuliani is in the works either for any type of pardon. Of course, he hasn't been charged with anything, and much less convicted of anything. So I think there'll be conventional pardons in all likelihood.
Okay, I want to move on. Rafael Bernal, looking at the city that we are all in right now, Washington, D.C. You know, COVID restrictions left Washington pretty empty, but if we look at the city right now, it's almost like a ghost town. As our reporter told us, there are thousands of troops deployed, as well as thousands of police we see in the city right now. What is the major concern among authorities? Do they fear that there could be a recurrence of that, the unrest we saw last week on Capitol Hill?
Well, originally that was the concern, and that was a concern over the weekend. We saw that didn't pan out. There really weren't any protests of note. There were a few arrests of people who were carrying firearms. Of course, it's more complicated to carry firearms in the district. It's not entirely illegal because of the Second Amendment, but it's more difficult than, say, in Virginia. So there were some arrests of that nature. But also, I mean, it is a show of military power and a show of security power that dissuaded anyone from making a new protest of the type that stormed the Capitol last week. And there's one thing I do want to push back. There's been a lot of talk. People say that D.C. looks like a war zone. Mm-hmm. Now, that is precisely what D.C. does not look like. There is a very large security contingent because there was obviously a lapse in security with the storming of the Capitol. But it's been this show of security has prevented D.C. from looking like anything like a war zone. It is everything but. So it's simply, to this moment, we see a deployment that has worked, has dissuaded. If there was anything planned, of course, there's no certainty of that, in part because so many social media channels were closed, which is where that chatter was picked up.
I get your point about D.C. not being a war zone, Rafael, but I mean, if you look at the pictures, it's so different from, of course, from previous inaugurations when we see huge crowds on the National Mall. When we look at the pictures now, I mean, what kind of a message does that send to the rest of the world, for that matter?
Well, it is disturbing, and that is true. It is disturbing that a security deployment of this size is deemed necessary, as is even is even possible. 25,000 troops. That is a lot. That is a very sizable military force. You see pictures of people taking photos with soldiers in all parts of DC, all over the mall, here on Capitol Hill. It's become sort of like a terror tourism thing. People taking pictures of those barricades set up along the street. So it doesn't send the best message in terms of the health of America's democracy. But that message that America's democracy had a crisis and is under crisis was very obvious with the storming of the Capitol. It does send a very good message of the United States is able to respond to this sort of circumstance and sort of extracurricular situation, if you will, in force, and there is not the possibility of an attack, foreign or domestic, on a very secure Capitol as it stands today.
All right, Douglas Sloan, let's talk about the president's program. As we heard from our reporter, it's a very ambitious program that Joe Biden has. In his first days in office, in fact, he's talked about a $1.9 trillion economic and COVID rescue plan, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, as we heard, also lifting the travel ban as well. Here's what the president-elect had to say. Let's listen.
Look, our plan is as clear as it is bold. Get more people vaccinated for free. Create more places for them to get vaccinated. Mobilize more medical teams to get the shots in people's arms. Increase supply and get it out the door as soon as possible. This will be one of the most challenging operational efforts ever undertaken by our country. But you have my word that we will manage the hell out of this operation.
Douglas, of course, the president is going to need help from Republicans to get through parts of this program. How does he reach out across the aisle to Republicans, especially now when we see the country is so polarized, so divided?
Given that the United States is essentially one of the hot spots of the coronavirus right now, I can't imagine, and perhaps one of the Republican analysts you have on here, Adolfo, could speak to it. I can't imagine that the Republicans would be pushing back on any effort by President-elect, soon-to-be President Joe Biden to get shots in arms and immunize and vaccinate as many Americans as humanly possible so we can get through this and get our economy back on track and get back to the business of being the United States of America. I just don't see it. I've been surprised by Republicans before. I'll be very candid with you, but I would hope and pray that Republicans would be very open and amenable to working with Joe Biden to immunize as many Americans as possible so that we can get this economy rolling again. Because remember, the economy took such a big hit because we had to go into quarantine in so many different cities and municipalities around the country. So the sooner we can get people immunized, the sooner we can get people back to work. And I would think that Republicans would be all in on that game plan.
Adolfo, to Douglas's point on fighting the COVID crisis, there could possibly be a bipartisan effort to combat that. But what about other parts of President-elect Biden's program, things like the $1.9 trillion economic rescue package? It calls for more money for families, those checks that he's talked about, more money for unemployed, more money for businesses as well. Is that going to happen?
Well, you know, my friend Douglas is, I have a lot of respect for him, and he knows what I'm going to say on this. There are a couple of things. There's a lot of agreement on aspects of that plan that Republicans will support. Of course, President Trump was supporting the large amount that President-elect Biden is now proposing in terms of checks to people. So that's clearly the bipartisan agreement on that. We wouldn't be where we are in terms of the vaccine without Operation Warp Speed, and we wouldn't be anywhere near in terms of the distribution, the development, had it not been for Donald Trump. Here's where the disagreement comes in, though. the things that are in there that are not COVID related, and some of them by the admission of the Biden administration. For example, a $15 minimum wage has nothing to do with COVID. It doesn't. That's a legitimate debate to have, but not in a COVID package. There are aspects of cybersecurity and its costs that are also not pertinent to COVID. And then, of course, there is the big sticking point, which is bailing out large states that have been mismanaged, of course, for many, many years pre-COVID. And this is an opportunity and a crisis the Democrats are seizing upon to be able to pay for really misdeeds and mismanagements of the past.
Right.
There, and the specifics and the details is where you're going to have Republicans object. We're all on the COVID train. We're not on the gravy train when it comes to bailing out these large states and to doing things that are part of the liberal agenda unrelated to COVID.
Right. Katie, I want to move to one other big development in Washington over the past 2 weeks, and that is the impeachment of Donald Trump. The House of Representatives, where the Democrats do have a majority, impeached President Trump a second time. It's unclear at this stage whether the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, will send these articles of impeachment to the U.S. Senate. But with President Trump leaving in just 2 days, what's the point of this exercise?
Well, there's a couple of things that Democrats see as the point of this exercise. One is that they believe that the president incited an insurrection at the United States Capitol, that individuals attacked the beacon of democracy that is the United States Capitol, and that he should be held to account for that regardless of whether he's in office. I think that's part of the political motivation. And the secondary motivation is a vote that they can take after a conviction vote that would essentially prohibit President Trump from ever holding office ever again, among other consequences, as a part of the conviction and secondary vote. And I think that that is another political calculus that Democrats are going to have to weigh against COVID relief, against approving and confirming President-elect Biden's nominees to the cabinet. They're going to have to walk and chew gum, and it will become clearer in the next week or so whether actually convicting President Trump will be a priority up there with COVID relief, which they are touting as their most important priority in the coming days.
Adolfo, very quickly, if you can, you're the lawyer. Could you clarify something for us? Impeachment pertains to the office holder, isn't it? And if the holder of the office is no longer there, what's the point?
Well, correct.
The point is...
Sorry, go ahead, Adolfo. Katie, I'll get back to you.
The impeachment process as designed, and I know we'll have disagreements here, are to remove individuals from office that are holding office. That's what that is. That's left to the courts, I mean, to the Congress to do that. Right. He has effectively been removed from office by the voters.
Right.
And impeachment taking place post being in office, I argue, the Congress has no jurisdiction over a private citizen to hold the impeachment. There is something called writ of attainder, which is simply a way of saying the legislature is acting as a court without a trial and evidence. Of course, we don't do writs of attainder, but this is exactly what this impeachment, and more importantly, the trial which is key. The trial would be one that is moot. He is no longer in office. Yeah. It is a naked political exercise to, as Katie says, to try to preclude him from running for office, and that would actually backfire, and that's certainly not very unifying if that's what Joe Biden wants.
All right, Katie, very quickly.
I would just say that the rules of a Senate impeachment trial are not bound by the typical legal justiciable rules in the United States. They're not guided by a lawyer doesn't even have to represent the president. The president could represent himself pro se. And so all of the calculuses that we include when we're having a trial in the United States are not the same, and it's entirely politically driven by the United States Senate.
But this right by the Constitution. But the Constitution has a role in this. There's no question whether this is constitutional or not.
Okay. I'm going to go to Douglas. Douglas, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, why pursue this? As we pointed out, President Trump will be leaving office. I mean, does this action not run the risk of further radicalizing and inflaming Trump supporters?
Well, the bottom line is this. there was a fundamental abuse of power here
Yeah.
regarding the president's actions and why the Democrats are seeking impeachment. And if the Democrats were, say, not to impeach, then the precedent would be established that any president could do whatever he wants as long as he waited long enough to the last 2 weeks of office, and then there would be no consequences.
Right.
There would be no, nothing would happen to him.
But
so they really have to establish a precedent here. And I'm going to push back on Adolfo for a bit. There are legal precedents to impeaching people once they've left office. As I'm sure he's aware, I think it was back in 1789 where they impeached Senator William Blount after he left office, as well as 1876, where the Secretary of War, William Belknap, was impeached after he left office. So there is a legal precedent here. And I think it's important that we see this process through the trial in the Senate. Trump will have his day in court in the form of a trial in the U.S. Senate.
Okay. Rafael, let's talk about another big program that the president-elect is talking about, and that is immigration. Biden wants to send a comprehensive immigration bill to Congress in his first week in office, possibly the first day in office. It would offer legal status to 11 million people in the country who are undocumented right now. Where do you think this will go?
Well, it's actually a pretty complicated. The Democrats are juggling a lot of balls because they're cleaning up an administration that basically went opposite of where they would have gone on almost anything. And immigration is sort of the biggest case in point. So the first thing that Democrats want and Biden wants is to provide some sort of relief for the undocumented, for the 11 million undocumented. And they're starting off big for many reasons, because it's politically smart to start off in asking a lot of your opposition, especially when you're in the majority, even if it's a slim majority, and because they really truly do believe that a large portion of those undocumented were the essential workers that kept this country humming, moving moderately throughout this pandemic. So where it's going, that is going to be that is the big question. You're already seeing from the right attacks against immigrants on sort of language you haven't heard in 5 years, saying that they increase pollution, they increase crime, there's overpopulation in the United States. A lot of, frankly, debunked arguments, but they're coming back, and the word caravan. Expect to hear that a lot, even though you can't really expect too many more caravans than you've been seeing on average over the past 5 years.
Right. Katie Barlow, no doubt there'll be a lot of debate over this bill. A lot of compromises will have to come from both sides. But do you think it could get through Congress?
I do, but the real question is going to be what actually makes it into the final bill. What the Biden-Harris administration will do is essentially send a wish list to Congress and say, these are the things that are important to us. Congress then has to take that and make sure both the House and the Senate agree, then pass that piece of legislation. But what comes next is almost certainly going to be litigation over perhaps the 11 million people who will then be provided a pathway to citizenship that will likely make its way up to the Supreme Court, which has 3 appointees from President Trump on the Supreme Court and may not rule in their favor. So even if it passes as law after it gets past the House and the Senate, they still have to get past the United States Supreme Court, and that's certainly not a guarantee.
Right. Adolfo, one other thing which we heard from our reporter at the beginning of the show, and that is a U.S. Senate committee will hold confirmation hearings Tuesday, that's tomorrow here in Washington, D.C., for the Treasury Secretary nominee, Janet Yellen. Another committee will also start hearings on the Secretary of State nominee, Tony Blinken. We have to remember that the Republicans still have a majority in the Senate when these hearings start. Is there any chance that these nominees could be rejected right from the beginning?
I don't believe so. I think there's a great deal of deference, although it's been less so in recent years, to the president's nominees. So I don't think we're going to start off the gate from the Republican side opposing these nominees. I will say Tony Blinken is a little more controversial than people think. He was up, and with a lot of opposition, the person I worked for, John McCain, opposed him and called him for Deputy Secretary of State completely unqualified and incompetent. And John McCain's one of those figures that Democrats seem to like these days, and they certainly bring him up often. So I think there'll be a lot of scrutiny, but I think there is going to be a lot of deference, as there should be, to the president's team and nominees, and those particular nominees that you're referring to. Janet Yellen, of course, has a reputation as the head of the Fed, and Tony Blinken's been by Biden's side for many, many years. I think they'll get through without a problem. I think one last thing on immigration. The idea, I worked on immigration for years, that we're going to have an immigration bill in 100 days is just pure fantasy. That's just not going to happen. I think the president-elect, or President Biden, will be doing a lot by executive order.
Right.
That he will push that, but I don't think there's going to be an immigration bill. And I think the optics now, with a caravan heading right now, making a lot of news from Honduras, is a terrible time. Remember, Donald Trump got elected on immigration, and that is still a divisive issue in our country.
Douglas, President Trump, of course, has been roundly criticized by the Democrats for what happened on Capitol Hill last week. He's also been criticized for what many describe as his incompetence over the pandemic. Yet, if we look at recent opinion polls on the president, an NBC poll, which has just come out, says 43% of voters nationwide approve of his performance. That's pretty stable. It was about 45% just before the election. 87% of Republicans approve of how this president, President Trump, is doing his job. Yep. How does one explain that?
Well, I can't explain the Republicans. I don't know what they're looking at. You know, the economy is in the tank. We're looking at a failed response to this pandemic. We're looking at social unrest throughout the country. There are many issues where Trump has simply dropped the ball, and I'm sure Adolfo's going to come back and say, well, look at the few issues where he actually did okay. But regarding the polling, it's actually pretty interesting. You know, I was looking at Rasmussen polls that had him at 33%, and then I looked at the average polls. The average of all the polls had him at about 38%, with about 38% approval rating, with about 59% disapproval rating. But the bottom line is this: it's south of 50. It is the worst in presidential history since they started faking polls. And I can't explain why the Republicans are so beholden to Trump. It seems more like Trump's party at this point, almost like a cult of personality here, as opposed to the Republican Party that we all had grown up with, a party of ideology and core values. And so I can't explain why they seem so beholden to Trump.
Okay,
but everyone else seems to have it where it should be.
Right, let me get Rafael's opinion very quickly. Rafael, you know, we may not be able to explain why people think that way, but do these polls tell us that President Trump is not going away, that he's going to be a force in Republican politics for some time to come?
Well, they tell us that he's going to have a claim to that, and that's clearly what he wants, and he will work to remain a force in Republican politics, not least because it protects him from a potential many civil and criminal lawsuits that might be coming his way. So yeah, he's a power. He's got a base.
We have to leave. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.